and 2 more strung out to the east. I always said to people that our church had a lot of width but not much depth. It was all east-west. One of the churches I went to once a month in the other minister's side of the parish. And it was a small church in a hall, really. It wasn't a church building, it was just sort of a hall that they had owned and I guess built for the purpose at the price they could afford. It was one big room, and then off to one side there was, I suppose, just a piece that stood out, and in there was the kitchen and the bathrooms, and I think there was some storage. It's a long time ago, but that's how I remember it. And after church on a Sunday, they would have their fellowship time there right where they were, but they had some tables and chairs set out at the back of the congregation for that purpose. And of course, one of the things they did, which we don't, many churches now don't, is they use china cups or china mugs. And so then after church, what did they have to do? Wash them up in the kitchen. And, you know, when you're a person who wants to help, you often ask, "Can I help you?" And the answer was always, no. It wasn't said unkindly like I just did. It was, no, look, you mix with the people and sit and talk with them. Week after week after week, the same answer. So, on the occasion when I was out there, I said to the leading light of the church, "Can I help you in the kitchen?" And before he could say no, I was out there, hands in the sink, and washing up the dishes. And he tried to get rid of me, but sometimes I'm immovable. Some people think as I've got older, I've got more immovable, but that's a different story, isn't it? I did this because the minister who was normally at that church had told me something about what was going on. There were 4, 5, maybe 6 people who always did the washing up and the clearing up in the kitchen. Always. Without doubt. And he said, what's actually happening out there is that they're making all the decisions for the church out there. It wasn't a parking lot, but it was where they were parked. And they didn't want anyone else in that group. A couple of ladies who had not been at the church very long, I was talking with them and I said, you know, it seems difficult to get out into the kitchen. And they said, we've offered many times and we've always been refused. I don't know where we fit in here. Where do I fit in? Is a good question, isn't it? Lisa has introduced me to lots of different things, and one of them is doing jigsaw puzzles. I was never a big one for jigsaw puzzles, but I am now. In fact, I have to admit, this one we've got now is very difficult, 1,000 pieces, but the cutting machine that cut the pieces didn't cut them all cleanly, and that makes it a little harder to put them in. And the pieces are more higgledy-piggledy. Is that an American word? They're more higgledy-piggledy than the usual jigsaw puzzle, and some of them have really odd shapes with the little tab in funny places. Anyway, so I sat there for a whole day one day, and I got a few pieces in. The interesting thing about doing jigsaw puzzles is there's really two ways to do them, isn't there? No, I'm not going to say the right way and the wrong way. I'm going to say you can have a gap in the puzzle and you look for the piece that fits the gap. I tend to use the other method. I look through the pieces and find a piece that has a peculiar shape and think to myself, it must be easy to find where that will go. So I work from the piece to the puzzle, whereas most of us work from the puzzle to the piece. And I think churches are like that. We tend to work from the puzzle to the piece. What do I mean? I was in a church in North Carolina during the time I was RVing before Lisa joined me in that venture, and I was at a build down there, and I decided to go to church on a Sunday morning, and I had to travel a few miles to get to one, and it was of a different denomination. You'll breathe a sigh of relief. The denomination didn't matter, it was what the people said. I sat behind a pew where there were three older ladies, and they were delightful, I guess, but unfortunately I was sitting behind them. And for those of you who've had that experience with myself, or maybe with Bill behind you, or Hollis, or you know what I'm going to say. They heard your voice. And I do love singing the hymns. And so I did, I sang. I just thought I can do what I like, and I can sing whatever part I like, and if it's not written, I'll make it up anyway, it doesn't matter. I can just do what I like with the hymns. And so after the service was finished, they turned around to me and they said, "You should be in the choir." Now that sounds like something friendly to say, doesn't it? Their choir had a gap, and they saw a piece of the puzzle, and they were going to put that piece in that gap in the choir. It was unfortunate for them that I had to tell them I'd only be here for 2 weeks, then I'll be off to Florida. So that put the end to that. But how often do we do that? We have a gap, and it might be we need a treasurer or a secretary or someone to fill in the blank. And here's someone new. Let's plug them in. Let's plug them in. I remember once that a man came to a parish that I was serving in Australia. It was the first parish that I served. A man and his wife, and he was a fairly big-framed man, and he was the new bank manager for the local bank. And so immediately one would think, aha, a new treasurer. But we didn't. We bit our tongue and waited. He turned up to a Bible study we were doing, which was called Kerygma. It's like doing a university course, Kerygma, if ever you've heard of it. It came out of the Presbyterian system, I believe. And it was pretty hefty. And he and his wife turned up on the day when the Bible study was focused on the Old Testament history, especially around that time when the nation was taken into exile. For those who've done their studies and know there's a lot of stuff about that. And this man just started talking about it. And he knew more than the book said, more than I knew, and it just turned out that that was his hobby. Old Testament ancient history. And that's what he really got excited about and wanted to join. And that they stayed with us all the way through those studies then. If we had never had him in that study, if he'd never joined that, we might have stuck with the treasurer idea. asking someone who spends all their time at work doing the treasury and to come and do a little more for free. Where do I fit in? Is a good question to keep in the back of our minds. Fitting in means knowing your way around the building, the congregation, being able to work out who's who in the zoo, knowing what is expected. In one church I served, it was one of those older stone brick churches, that looked like a cathedral cut down. And this pulpit is a little lower than that pulpit was. The minister's eyes would have been up about here, and the front row was about there. Okay? Now that front row was never used by the congregation, and there was a reason for that. I'll come back to that. But when there was a baptism and people who don't usually attend church, or at least not that church, come to church to see a member of their family, a baby, baptised, the elders of the church who were responsible for baptisms and organising things would always put them where? In the front row. And what do you know about sitting in the front row if you're a stranger and ever been to a church and you sit in the front row? What are some of the things you don't know? When to stand up, and, even worse, when to sit down. You don't know that. And you may be reading a bulletin, and there may be an asterisk in there at times, but you didn't see what that said, what that means, because it's not at the start of the service. Where is it, folks? Or on the back page, take your pick. We tell people after the fact. And so inevitably, there was the baptismal party standing at the end of every hymn, and we had to get used to saying, "You may all be seated," and making it look like that was normal. We are saying to them, you don't belong here, do you? Even though we might like you to, it is hard to fit in. And I'll go back to the reason why no one in the congregation ever sat in the front row. Because if I were another 3 feet above contradiction, and you were another 10 feet closer, what would you be doing all through the service? It's a neck breaker. It's a neck breaker. I said to the congregation or to the elders, please put them further back where they can see what's happening and not feel stupid. Jeremiah and Jesus were both called by God. Jeremiah, if you read carefully the text and the whole of his book, you'll realise that when he was called, he was a little bit younger than you and I. He was a lot younger than you and I. In fact, he may have been around 17. You ever thought about that? Jeremiah, a young adolescent, called by God to be a prophet, to say things out loud, to take all the knowledge he would have had of their history and their scriptures and his relationship with God and put it out there in front of all these people. And his immediate response, not me. I couldn't do that. Not me. That's not where I fit in. Jeremiah is a fascinating prophet to read because we know more about him than any other prophet in the Bible. purely because he tells us a lot about what happens, or his scribe tells us a lot about what happens. Every time Jeremiah opened his mouth, he was saying the opposite of what his people wanted to hear. It didn't matter if this week he said, "You're going into exile." They didn't want to hear that. And if a month later he said to them, "You're going to come out of exile," they said, "It's not possible." He was always, it seems, swimming against the stream. He never felt like he fitted in. He was thrown down a well to try and shut him up. He was put in jail. He was spoken against and criticised, and even the authorities put their hands on him to get rid of him. "Where do I fit in?" says Jeremiah. And then he rails at God. Here's an aside. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to get angry with God. God has big shoulders. God might say something after that you don't want to hear, but nevertheless, you're allowed to rail at God. Lightning will not strike you or the church. And Jeremiah does. He rails at God. I can imagine him just shouting at God. I once produced this as a play, the story of Jeremiah, and a friend of mine played Jeremiah. It was a solo play. He was the only actor. And he was in jail, and he just got it right. He railed at God and said what Jeremiah had said. "God, where do I fit in? Why am I always saying the thing that nobody wants to hear, and you won't stop me? You won't let me stop saying it. Even if I swallow your words, I have to keep babbling them out. Why? Where do I fit in? Where do I fit in?" And then look at Jesus. Here's the hometown boy. And he's got up to say some things, and oh boy, did they enjoy that. Until he started to say some things they didn't enjoy. And then they decided that this was not right, that this jumped up upstart needs to be dealt with. And the nearby cliff was the way to deal with him. It must have been the look on his face, or his non-combative demeanour, or maybe they suddenly felt a moment of guilt that allowed Jesus just to walk away from them and to escape what they had intended to do. Where do I fit in? Was also a problem for Jesus. And it's no surprise that twice in the Gospels Jesus is reaffirmed by God, "You are my son, and I am well pleased with you." Twice. Folks, we're looking to our future, aren't we? We're thinking about our church. We're thinking about, or we will be if we haven't started, what God is calling us to be, and also we have to ask the questions, who else is God calling to join us? And there is a real temptation for us to try and fit that piece into the gap in our puzzle, and thereby miss the man who knows Old Testament history better than anyone else, or the prophet who has real words to say rather than just what we want to hear, or the Saviour who brings the saving words of God. There's a real temptation to try and fit people into the slots that we need filled. And we need to not do that. Where do they fit in when they join us or when they come along to look at us? There's all sorts of ways in which we can make people feel like they don't quite belong. And you'll forgive me if I tread on your toes a little. Well, I'm asking you to. I'm not telling you to, I'm asking you to forgive. We ask people to read the scriptures. How often in your life do you stand up in front of a group of people, not at a church, and read out loud? If you're a school teacher, you might, or a librarian. But none of the rest of us do we? At one church, I realised this was happening and that it was a church full of young people. And I said to them, if you contact me during the week, we will arrange a time and I'll help you rehearse the reading so that you don't feel uncomfortable on the day. How often do you have to say words like Zarephath or synagogue? There's a few other words in the Bible that are real doozies, aren't they? I remember a friend of mine, well, he became a friend in one church, in a little country church, and he was asked to read the Bible reading, and he did. He sometimes preached as well, but he had to read the book of Acts on Pentecost Sunday. You know that section? Where it says, and they came from, and then it lists off all these ancient countries in the Old Testament world, and some of them are almost unpronounceable to our English-speaking tongues. And Russ was a big man and a jovial sort of young fellow. He was young at the time. And Russ got to that and he saw all these words and he just said wheelbarrow, skipped them all over and kept on going. And I think he was right. They are difficult. But how often we don't help mentor people so that they're comfortable doing what they'd really like to do, I think, is be the liturgist. Sometimes the liturgy has words in it, especially if Bruce Brewer wrote it, that are a little difficult, or a phrase that doesn't trip off the tongue like we're used to. And it's good if we can practice out loud in an unembarrassing situation with someone who knows what we should have actually said. How often do we give people a phrase to use after the Bible reading? Some people have actually asked for that. What do I say then? Because you've probably heard different things. Lisa used one today from someone else a week or so ago, and I use another one, and you might suddenly get to the end and say, oh, what do I say now? What do I say now? We can help one another, and especially newer people or people doing something new. We can watch the piece and help it fit into the puzzle better. What gift will the next person bring that we haven't even dreamt of? Now, I can make this little criticism because I've been involved and my wife has. But have you ever thought about designing the decoration for the church? As a person who is, say, a younger person, I don't mean a kid necessarily, but a younger person, who will use symbols and designs and colours that you and I, us older folk, would never think of. In fact, we'd even... I love Caleb, but I can remember my reaction the first day that I saw his fingernails painted. And I've noticed someone else has theirs painted today. and I wouldn't have expected it. A different world. Those puzzle pieces outside bring in a different world of colour and brightness and different meanings. I think of Peter, he won't mind me quoting him, and his games that they have, you know, with ancient Celtic symbols. What else can happen in our midst? And how can we mentor these people? And I'll just say a little bit about mentoring. When I was a little boy, my father had a British car. It had enough power to pull the hat off your head, but not much more. It was one of those old cars. It was a panel van, actually, if you know what that is. And because it was an older car without all this modern technology, in the suspension and the steering, on every joint, there was a grease zerk. In Australia we call them grease nipples, but I know over here you call them zerks, don't you? And they had to be greased fairly regularly, far more regularly than we would ever dream of today. In fact, there were 2 zerks on my Tundra towing our RV, and I found them on each end of the tail shaft. No one had ever greased them in 80,000 miles. So I got a friend under there with his grease gun and he greased them, and a little dink that used to occur stopped dinking. There were 17 zerks under my father's car. I can tell you where each one of them was. It's burnt into my memory because Dad said to me, hop under here with me. Now, you take the grease gun and you put it on the zerk and you make sure it's on and you pump the handle until the grease comes out here. If it comes out at the zerk, you haven't put it on properly, and so on and so on and so forth. Those of you who've done that know what that's all about. And after a while, he would just let me do it. He would say, here you are, they need greasing again. He mentored me into that. Fortunately, I like doing it too. We can mentor people by helping them and showing them and teaching them and even sharing with them our understanding of the faith. As Alice Hewson said in our centering thought, the best feeling in the world is to feel wanted, part of something and valued, being included and able to comfortably participate. And as my last example, it comes from Michigan and not from a church. You can all breathe a sigh of relief. Some ladies that I happened to meet, for whatever reason I don't know, they had boys, young boys, and they said to me, you know, my son plays soccer. I put him in the football club originally, that's that other game. I put him in that club, and for one whole season, the boy sat on the bench. He never got to play a single game. So she said, I pulled him out of that and put him in the soccer team. And he plays just about every week or two. He gets to be included instead of excluded. It wouldn't be remiss of me if I didn't give one final example, and this is the example that actually set me on this path. We watch a lot of cricket, my wife and I. Well, she watches a lot because I happen to watch it. I've got to bring in a cricket example, Paul, it's just for you. One of the greatest players in the world, the Australian, Glenn Maxwell, he's just a magnificent player. He's in his late 30s, so he won't be playing much longer. The oldest player on the field is 42, and he's a miracle. But Glenn is a great player. He's a great batsman, he's a great bowler, he's a great tactician, he's an excellent fielder. Drops one now and then, but not very often. They played a game and his team won. And as he walked off the field, the two teams walked off together. He put his arm on the shoulders of a young fellow who might have been 19 or 20 from the opposing team. And he walked off with him, and you could tell what he was doing. They were both smiling, so he wasn't having a go at him. He was actually giving him some mentoring and talking about the game and how he could improve his skills. Even the commentators said it was wonderful to see. I invite you to be a mentoring church who will take the Jeremiahs and the Jesuses and the other people, the lad who didn't get to play, the person who doesn't know how to fit in, the stutterers who are not sure how to read the scriptures, to mentor those in a way that they feel comfortable with and that suits what God is calling them to do. I know that our interim minister will help us do that. She will sit in the balcony, as the interim ministry says. We're taught to sit in the balcony and observe what's happening. Now, she's not literally going to sit in the balcony, please. It's all right. But that's what the mentality is, to sit in the balcony and watch what happens and see who fits in and who doesn't, and where they fit in and what's happening where they don't. May God bless us, as I know we will be blessed in this time to come. Amen. I invite you again to stand if you are able or willing and turn to the hymn 388 or watch it on the screen. Help us accept each other.